Hey dreamers, tonight we're stepping into the quiet shadows of a mountainside, to the exact moment when cleverness itself took its first breath. This is the story of Hermes, a god whose beginning wasn't marked by thunder or prophecy, but by something far more surprising, pure, unstoppable ingenuity. Because within hours of entering the world, Hermes did something no newborn god had ever done, and it set the tone for everything he would become. And that's where the mystery begins. How does a child of the gods outsmart the heavens before he can even walk? What sparks that kind of brilliance? And why is it that the smallest gestures from Hermes often reshape the biggest stories? Before we settle in, tap like if these stories help you unwind, and hit subscribe so you never miss a new mythic journey. And tell me in the comments, which Greek god has always been your favorite? The story begins long before Hermes' birth, in the calculated secrecy that only a god conducting an affair could manage. Zeus, king of all the gods, father of gods and men, had found himself captivated by a nymph named Maia. She lived far from Olympus, in a hidden cave on Mount Selene in Arcadia, in the southern reaches of Greece, a place so remote and shadowed that even the watchful eyes of Hera, Zeus's eternally suspicious wife, would never think to look. And so, under the cover of night, Zeus would steal away from his palace in the clouds and make his descent to that quiet cave in the mountains. These visits were secret, whispered things, invisible to the gossiping immortals of Olympus. Hera, for all her power and all her rage, knew nothing of this liaison, and that secrecy would prove to be Hermes' first gift, an entrance into the world unannounced, unremarked, and therefore unconstrained by the jealous attention of heaven. At dawn on the day of his birth, the world shifted. Maia, the Pleiad nymph daughter of Atlas, that ancient titan who holds the sky, felt the first signs of labour. She had been chosen by Zeus, bedded in secrecy, and now she would bring forth something unprecedented, a son who would be neither fully of the mortal realm nor entirely bound by the rules of Olympus. When Hermes emerged into the light, he did not cry out like other infants. He did not wail or flail or demand milk and comfort as the gods might have expected. Instead, there was something in his eyes, even then, a sharp intelligence, a restless curiosity, a mind already calculating the world around him. Maia, exhausted from her labour, wrapped her newborn son in soft swaddling cloths and cradled him briefly before her body gave in to the weight of motherhood. She lay down to sleep, placing the infant in a woven basket, a cradle of sorts nearby. The cave was quiet then, filled with the gentle sound of her breathing and the soft cooing of her new son. But this quietness would not last long. The moment Maia's eyes closed and her breathing deepened into true sleep, Hermes' behaviour transformed entirely. Perhaps it was the divine blood coursing through his veins that made him different. Perhaps it was some spark of cosmic mischief that had been waiting for its vessel since the beginning of time itself. Whatever the cause, the infant Hermes became restless, not with the ordinary fussiness of a newborn, but with intention. He began to wriggle against his swaddling cloths, testing them, probing them, searching for weakness in their weave. The fibres that bound him, meant to keep a mortal child secure and safe, were nothing but minor inconveniences to divine will. With movements that seemed less like the threshing of an infant, and more like the calculated escape of the prisoner breaking free from chains, Hermes worked himself loose. The cloths began to unravel, leaving gaps through which he could slip his small limbs. His mother slept on, unaware that the god of thieves was, in his very first hours, already practicing his trade, stealing his own freedom from his cradle. Finally free from his bindings, Hermes rose on surprisingly steady feet. Here was another sign of his strangeness, a newborn who should have been unable to stand, who should have been helpless and dependent, instead moved with purpose through the cave. The space around him was familiar already, as if some part of him had been awake before birth, observing, learning, remembering. He made his way toward the entrance of the cave, his eyes adjusting to the pale light of early morning. The world beyond beckoned, vast, unexplored, full of possibilities that his divine nature was already eager to investigate. As he stepped out into the fresh mountain air, Hermes encountered his first challenge, his first opportunity, his first choice, a mountain tortoise, slowly making its way across the rocky ground. Now, in another universe, in another context, a newborn god might have felt wonder, might have reached out with the tentative curiosity of an infant. But Hermes was not bound by such conventions. He saw the tortoise, and he saw potential. He saw the instrument waiting to be born from this creature's shell, the invention that no one yet had dreamed of creating. The speed of his decision-making was almost brutal in its clarity and efficiency, a signature of divine project management, one might say, though the efficiency came dressed in the clothing of pure childhood mischief. Hermes scooped up the tortoise with surprising gentleness, considering what was about to happen. He flipped the animal over, and with the swift mercy of someone who understood that hesitation serves no one, he ended its life. The shell remained, empty now, clean, ready to become something new. Hermes carried this prize back into his cave, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He had seen instruments in his divine blood memory, echoes of things that gods knew about even if they hadn't experienced them yet. He had an instinct for creation that was almost shocking in its confidence. He found the gut strings of sheep, or perhaps he conjured them. The exact details matter less than the fact that Hermes understood, in that moment, what music was waiting to exist. He took those strings and stretched them across the tortoise shell, creating what he called the lyre. This was not random play. This was not a child experimenting blindly. This was an act of creation performed by someone who already understood resonance, frequency, the science of sound, made manifest in physical form. The god of thieves had just invented the instrument of the god of music, and he had done so before Apollo even knew what he was missing. Now imagine, if you will, the timeline of Hermes' first day of existence on Earth. Born at dawn, escaped his cradle before sunrise, invented the lyre by midday. All of this accomplished while still covered in the evidence of his birth, while his mother slept in the cave behind him. But Hermes was not satisfied. Escape was one victory, creation was another. But the greatest gift of cunning, the true mark of genius, is knowing when you need something, and knowing exactly how to obtain it. By the time Apollo's sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, Hermes felt the hunger that only a rapidly growing divine body could produce. His metabolism was burning through energy at a rate that mortal children could never match. He needed food, real nourishment, substantial fuel for the cosmic force animating his small frame. And so, with a confidence that borders on audacity, he made a decision that would reshape his entire existence. He would steal from his own half-brother. He would journey far from his birthplace, and make his way to Pieria, where Apollo, god of the sun, of prophecy, of music itself, kept a herd of sacred cattle. The journey itself was remarkable. A newborn should have been unable to walk such distances. A newborn should have been exhausted, confused, lost in terrain he had never seen before. But Hermes was no ordinary newborn, and the distance that would take a man days to cover was nothing to divine legs driven by purpose and hunger. He travelled across the countryside, his mind still sharp, still calculating, still thinking several moves ahead of the rest of the universe. By the time he reached Pieria, the sun was already beginning to sink, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep blue. What he found there was nothing short of a miracle of opportunity. 50 cattle, sacred to Apollo, grazing without adequate guard, without the constant vigilance that divine property should receive. It was, from a certain perspective, almost negligent, leaving such valuable animals so lightly watched. Apollo, for all his intelligence and power, had not anticipated that his newborn half-brother would be both willing and capable of such theft. This represented a lesson that the gods would learn again and again throughout history. Arrogance and preparation, it turns out, are not the same thing. Hermes did not hesitate. He had been born hours earlier, and already he was committing his first major crime, though from his perspective it was simply resource acquisition. He began to drive the cattle away from Apollo's grove, moving them with surprising skill for someone who had never herded before. But here is where true cunning emerges. Hermes did not simply flee with the animals in a straight line. Instead, he set about confusing any potential tracker. He fashioned makeshift sandals, overlarge and crude, designed to leave footprints so enormous and strange that anyone following would question whether they were even real. Then he drove the cattle backward, forcing them to walk in reverse, so that to any observer it would appear that the herd was approaching rather than departing. The sun had set completely now, and in darkness, Hermes guided the stolen cattle far from the sacred grove. His mind was working on multiple levels simultaneously, watching for pursuit, planning his hiding places, considering how he would explain himself if caught, though it seems likely he had already decided that explanation was less important than performance. By the time he finally hidden the herd in a secluded cave, night had fully claimed the world. Hermes himself was exhausted, a rare thing for a divine being, but birth and travel and theft had taken their toll. He made his way back to Mount Selene, back to the cave where his mother still slept, where his cradle still waited with its broken swaddling cloths. With a cunning move that suggested he already understood that the appearance of innocence was sometimes more valuable than actual innocence, Hermes re-wrapped himself in the cloths. He settled into his cradle, arranging his small form with studied casualness, the picture of a helpless newborn who had done nothing more than sleep the day away. When Maya finally woke, she found her son nestled in his crib as if he had never left, as if the entire adventure had never occurred. But mothers, even divine ones, have an instinct that transcends sleep and deception. Maya looked at her son, and something in her eyes suggested that she understood. Perhaps it was the brightness in his gaze. Perhaps it was the way he lay there with perfect composure, just a bit too settled, too calm, too knowing. She did not ask questions yet, but she watched him. She saw something in this infant that went far beyond what infants typically possessed, a kind of moral flexibility, a capacity for deception so effortless it was almost casual, and most importantly, a complete absence of remorse or shame. We're still wandering through that first extraordinary day of Hermes' life, that day when the universe learned what it means to be outsmarted by something small, something new, something that should not yet have possessed the capacity for such magnificent deception. The sun has travelled its ancient path across the sky, and now we turn our attention to the theft itself, not merely as an act of taking what belongs to another, but as an exhibition of divine intelligence so complete, so perfectly executed, that it would become the template for every trickster, every boundary crosser, every clever soul who has ever looked at the rules of the world and decided they were more like suggestions. But before we dive into the mechanics of the theft, we need to understand the magnitude of what Hermes was about to attempt. Apollo's cattle were not merely animals, they were sacred property, divine wealth, symbols of the sun god's power and prestige. These were not beasts left unattended by carelessness or neglect, but rather creatures grazing in the valley of Pieria in Macedonia, under what should have been the watchful dominion of one of Olympus's most powerful gods. Apollo, after all, was the god of prophecy, of truth, of light itself, the one who could see through deception with the same clarity that his sun illuminates the darkest corners of the earth. To steal from Apollo was not simply theft, it was an act of cosmic audacity, a challenge to the very notion that divine power could protect what it claimed as its own. And yet Hermes, hours old, still carrying the scent of birth, with a mind that operated at speeds that made mortal thought seem glacial by comparison, looked at those cattle and saw opportunity where others might have seen only danger. The hunger that drove him was real enough, the divine metabolism burning through energy with an intensity that demanded fuel. But there was something more at work here, something that went beyond mere physical need. This was the first test of his nature, the inaugural demonstration of the principle that would define him for all eternity, that the world belonged not to those who claimed ownership, but to those clever enough to take what they wanted and escape the consequences. The journey from Mount Cyllene to Pieria was nothing short of remarkable for an infant god, but Hermes moved with a purpose that transcended the limitations of his newborn form. His legs, which should have been weak and unsteady, carried him across terrain that would have exhausted grown men, across valleys and mountain passes, through forests and meadows bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The landscape passed beneath his feet like a dream, and with each step his mind was already several moves ahead, already calculating not just the theft itself, but the escape, the concealment, the inevitable confrontation that would follow. Because Hermes understood, even then, that success in trickery was never about a single moment of deception. It was about constructing a narrative so complex, so layered with misdirection, that even those who suspected the truth would find themselves unable to prove it. Number. By the time he arrived in Pieria, the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in those particular shades of orange and deep violet that marked the transition between day and night, between Apollo's domain and the realm of shadows where cleverness thrives. And there, grazing in pastoral innocence, were the cattle, 50 magnificent beasts, sacred to Apollo, their hides gleaming in the fading light. Some accounts speak of 12 heifers and 100 cows never yoked, along with the bull who mounted them. But the exact number matters less than what they represented. Divine property, guarded by dogs who should have been vigilant, protected by the reputation of a god who had never been successfully robbed before. Now, a lesser thief might have simply driven the cattle away in a straight line, relying on speed and distance to escape detection. But Hermes was not a lesser thief. He was, in fact, inventing the very concept of sophisticated theft, creating the playbook that every cunning soul would study for millennia to come. He understood that the theft itself was only the beginning, that the real artistry lay in making the crime impossible to trace, impossible to prove, impossible to punish, even when suspicion pointed directly at the guilty party. The first challenge was the guardian dogs, those faithful animals who had been bred and trained to protect Apollo's herd from predators and rustlers. These were not ordinary dogs. They were divine servants, attuned to threats both mortal and supernatural, and under normal circumstances, their barking would have raised an alarm that would echo across the valleys and bring swift retribution. But Hermes, drawing upon powers that he seemed to understand instinctively, despite his newborn state, cast upon them a stupor, a divine enchantment that robbed them of their vigilance and strangled their ability to bark. The dogs forgot the cows, forgot their purpose, forgot everything except a strange drowsiness that settled over them like a heavy blanket. They lay down in the grass and watched with glassy, uncomprehending eyes as the infant god began to move among the herd. Hermes worked with an efficiency that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before, though of course this was his very first theft. The prototype, the original sin of cunning that would echo through every heist, every con, every brilliant deception that followed. He moved among the cattle with gentle authority, speaking to them perhaps, or simply exerting that divine will that made resistance impossible. The animals, sensing something beyond their comprehension, began to move under his guidance, leaving their familiar grazing grounds and following this strange small figure who commanded them with such confidence. But here is where the true genius revealed itself, where Hermes demonstrated that his intelligence operated on a level that even the other gods had not yet fully appreciated. He did not simply drive the cattle away in the normal fashion, with the animals walking forward in the direction of travel, leaving tracks that any competent tracker could follow straight to their destination. Instead, he grabbed each animal by the tail and forced them to walk backward, so that their hoof prints would point in the wrong direction entirely. To anyone following those tracks, it would appear that the herd had been walking toward Pieria rather than away from it, approaching Apollo's grazing lands rather than departing them. The logical conclusion would be that these were different cattle, or that the tracker was following the trail in the wrong direction, or that some strange confusion had occurred. But Hermes was not finished with his preparations. The backward-walking cattle were merely the first layer of his deception. He fashioned makeshift sandals for himself, crude and overlarge, designed to leave footprints so enormous and bizarre that anyone examining them would question their reality. Were these the tracks of a giant? Of some mythological creature? Of something that should not and could not exist? The prints were too large to belong to a child, too strange to belong to any known being, and this confusion was exactly what Hermes intended. He understood that the best way to hide the truth was not to erase all evidence, but rather to leave evidence so contradictory, so impossible to interpret, that investigators would doubt their own senses. Sasha. According to some accounts, he also fastened brushwood to the tails of the cattle, so that as they walked backward, mind you, the branches would sweep across the ground behind them, wiping away or confusing the very tracks that he had already made misleading. Every step of this theft was calculated, every detail considered, every potential point of discovery anticipated and neutralized. This was not the work of a desperate infant stealing food. This was a masterclass in deception, a demonstration that intelligence and forethought could overcome any disadvantage of size, age, or apparent weakness. The night had fallen completely by the time Hermes began driving the stolen cattle away from Pieria, guiding them across the countryside under cover of darkness. The moon may have been his only companion, casting pale light on the strange procession of backward-walking cattle led by a newborn god in oversized sandals, leaving a trail of confusion and impossibility behind them. The journey was long, much longer than the journey to Pieria had been, because now he was burdened with 50 reluctant animals who did not understand why they were walking in such an unnatural fashion, who protested with low, bellowing sounds that Hermes had to soothe and quiet lest they attract attention. As he travelled through Boeotia, driving the cattle through unfamiliar territory in the deepest part of night, Hermes encountered an old man working late in his vineyard, tending his vines by lamplight or moonlight, engaged in the kind of agricultural labour that does not respect the boundaries of day and night. The old man looked up and saw this impossible sight: a small figure, barely more than a baby, driving a herd of magnificent cattle through the darkness. The strangeness of it should have alarmed him, should have prompted questions or suspicions, but Hermes was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Take one of these cows," Hermes told the old man, his voice somehow carrying authority despite his infant form. "Just don't tell anyone that you saw me drive the cows away here." The old man, delighted with such an unexpected and generous gift. A cow was wealth, was security, was the answer to countless problems, readily agreed to keep silent. He gave his word to Hermes that he would not reveal what he had seen, that he would forget this strange midnight transaction as soon as it ended. But Hermes, who understood human nature with the same instinctive clarity that he understood everything else, did not trust this promise. He hid the cattle in a nearby forest and changed his appearance, a feat of divine transformation that should have been far beyond the capabilities of a newborn, but which Hermes accomplished as easily as breathing, and then returned to the old man. Now appearing as a different person entirely, perhaps an older traveller or a searching authority figure, Hermes approached the vintner and asked, "Tell me, did a boy drive cows through here? If you tell me where he drove them, I will give you a bull and a cow." The old man did not hesitate long. The temptation of additional wealth, the chance to double his unexpected fortune, proved too strong for his conscience to resist. He showed Hermes exactly where the boy had driven the stolen cattle, breaking his word without apparent remorse, motivated by greed and opportunity. And Hermes, Confronted with this proof of human faithlessness, with this demonstration that promises meant nothing when weighed against personal gain, felt a terrible anger rise within him. This was perhaps the first time the newborn god experienced betrayal, the first time he understood that even sworn oaths could be discarded when convenience demanded it. In his rage, and the rage of gods is never a small thing, never a mere tantrum or passing emotion, but rather a force of nature that reshapes reality. Hermes transformed the old man into silent stone. The vintner became a rock, mute and immobile, condemned to eternal silence as punishment for breaking his word, for choosing greed over honor, for failing the simplest test of trustworthiness. It was a harsh lesson, perhaps, and one might argue that the punishment exceeded the crime. But Hermes was establishing a principle that would define him throughout eternity, that words have power, that oaths create binding obligations, and that betrayal carries consequences that transcend mortal understanding. Sifter. With the faithless vintner now reduced to geological testimony to the importance of keeping promises, Hermes returned to his stolen cattle and continued his journey toward Pylos. The distance must have seemed endless, the night eternal. But divine endurance has its own rules, its own capacity for persistence that mortal stamina cannot match. By the time he finally reached his destination, a secluded area near Pylos, far from Pieria, far from Apollo's immediate sphere of influence, the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky. Now came another decision. Another demonstration of Hermes' extraordinary capacity for strategic thinking. He had successfully stolen the cattle, had transported them across vast distances, had left a trail of confusion and impossibility behind him. But simply hiding them was not enough. He needed to take possession of them in a deeper sense, needed to transform them from Apollo's property into something else entirely. And so, despite his youth, despite the fact that he had been alive for less than a full day, Hermes decided to make sacrifice to the gods. He selected 2 cattle from the herd, not the finest, perhaps, but suitable specimens for the purpose he intended. With swift mercy and divine efficiency, he slaughtered them, performing the kill with the kind of competence that should have required years of practice and experience. He pinned their hides on rocks, displaying them in the ritual fashion, and then set about preparing the meat. Some of it he boiled for his own meal, satisfying that ravenous divine hunger that had motivated the theft in the first place. The rest he burned as an offering to the gods. And here we encounter one of the most fascinating details of the entire story. Hermes divided the meat into 12 portions, one for each of the Olympian gods, creating what may have been the first formal sacrifice of its kind, establishing a ritual pattern that would be followed for generations. But despite his hunger, despite the fact that he had stolen these cattle specifically to feed himself, Hermes did not eat the sacrificial portions. He burned them entirely, sending the smoke skyward as an offering to the divine powers, including, presumably, to Apollo himself, whose cattle had provided the meat. This was trickery on a level that transcended mere theft. Hermes was using Apollo's own property to honor Apollo, creating a religious obligation that complicated the very crime he had just committed. After consuming his portion and completing the sacrifice, Hermes set about destroying all evidence of what had occurred. He scattered the remains of the fire, hid the bones and ashes, eliminated every trace that might indicate a ritual had taken place at this location. Then he turned his attention to concealing the remaining cattle, the 48 animals that still represented Apollo's stolen wealth. He found a cave, a hidden space suitable for containing the herd, and here he employed one final brilliant deception. Rather than simply driving the cattle into the cave in the normal fashion, Hermes forced them to enter backward, leading them tail first into the darkness, so that the tracks outside the cave entrance would appear to lead outward rather than inward. To any investigator examining the scene, it would look as though cattle had exited the cave rather than entered it, as though the space was empty rather than full, as though the trail led away from this location rather than terminating here. Every single element of this theft had been considered, every potential weakness addressed, every avenue of investigation preemptively closed off. CA. By the time Hermes finished securing the cattle in their backward-entered hiding place, exhaustion was finally beginning to claim even his divine stamina. The night's work had been extraordinary. The journey to Pieria, the theft itself, the long drive to Pylos, the encounter with the faithless vintner, the sacrifice, the concealment. For a god who had been born only hours earlier, it represented an accomplishment that should have been impossible, a demonstration of capability that redefined what immortals could achieve. But Hermes understood that the final act of this performance was perhaps the most important of all. He needed to establish an alibi, needed to create plausible deniability, needed to be somewhere else entirely when Apollo discovered the theft. And so, as dawn approached and the world prepared itself for another day of Apollo's sunlight, Hermes made his way back to Mount Selene, back to the cave where his mother Maia still slept, unaware of her son's nocturnal adventures. The journey back must have seemed both shorter and longer than the outward trip, shorter because he was unburdened by cattle and travelling at divine speed, longer because exhaustion was making every step heavier, every movement more difficult. But he persisted, driven by the knowledge that timing was everything, that his deception would only succeed if every element fell into place with perfect precision. When he finally reached the cave, slipping through the entrance in the grey pre-dawn light, he found everything exactly as he had left it, his cradle still waiting, his swaddling cloths still dishevelled from his earlier escape, his mother still lost in the deep sleep of postpartum exhaustion. With movements that combined genuine tiredness with calculated performance, Hermes climbed back into his cradle and rewrapped himself in the swaddling cloths. He arranged himself with studied casualness, settling into a position that suggested he had never left, that he had spent the entire night sleeping peacefully like any normal newborn. His eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and to anyone entering the cave he would have appeared to be nothing more than an innocent infant, helpless and blameless, incapable of the extraordinary crimes that had just occurred. Maia woke some time later, as mothers do, with that instinctive awareness that daylight has arrived and duties await. She looked toward her son's cradle and saw him nestled there, apparently undisturbed, apparently exactly as she had left him. But something in her divine perception registered wrongness. Perhaps the way he lay just a bit too perfectly arranged, perhaps the brightness in his eyes when he briefly opened them, perhaps some maternal instinct that transcended logic and evidence. She watched him for a long moment, and though she did not yet know what he had done, she understood that this child was different, that he possessed capabilities and inclinations that went far beyond ordinary infant helplessness. More. Meanwhile, far away in Pieria, Apollo was discovering that something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. The god of prophecy, the god of truth and light, the god who could see through deception with divine clarity, looked at his grazing lands and realized that his cattle were missing. 50 magnificent animals, or 12 heifers and 100 cows, depending on which account you follow, had simply vanished during the night, disappearing without adequate explanation. The guardian dogs lay in their strange stupor, unable to explain their failure, unable to remember what had happened. And when Apollo began to search for tracks, for evidence, for any clue that might point toward the thief, he found only confusion and impossibility. The hoofprints led in the wrong direction entirely. They appeared to show cattle approaching, rather than departing, arriving at the grazing lands rather than leaving them. There were enormous, bizarre footprints that seemed too large to belong to any known creature, too strange to be real. There were signs that brushwood had been dragged across the ground, obscuring and confusing whatever evidence might have existed. Apollo, for all his divine wisdom and prophetic power, found himself confronted with a crime scene that made no logical sense, that violated the basic principles of tracking and investigation. that seemed designed specifically to frustrate even omniscient understanding. He searched throughout the region, following false trails and impossible leads, growing increasingly frustrated and angry with each passing hour. The sun god, whose light reveals all secrets, could not illuminate this particular mystery through ordinary means. The prophetic abilities that allowed him to see future and past were somehow clouded when it came to this specific theft, this particular crime. It was as though the universe itself was conspiring to protect the thief, as though some new force had entered the world that operated by rules Apollo did not yet fully understand. Eventually, Apollo's search led him to Pylos, following some instinct or divine intuition that pointed him in the right direction despite the misleading evidence. He arrived at the area where Hermes had hidden the cattle, and he examined the cave where they were concealed. But even here, even standing directly outside the hiding place, Apollo was deceived by Hermes' final trick. The tracks outside the cave led outward, suggesting exit rather than entrance, indicating that the space was empty rather than full. Apollo looked at those backward tracks and drew the logical but incorrect conclusion that no cattle had entered here, that his search must continue elsewhere, that he was still missing some crucial piece of information. The frustration must have been extraordinary for a god accustomed to omniscience, accustomed to seeing truth with perfect clarity. Apollo was learning the same lesson that mortals had always known, but gods rarely experienced, that intelligence and preparation could overcome even divine power, that the clever could outwit the strong, that being right was not the same as being able to prove it. And somewhere in a cave on Mount Selene, wrapped in swaddling cloths and feigning sleep, Hermes knew exactly what Apollo was experiencing, because he had planned for precisely this frustration, had counted on precisely this confusion. The theft of Apollo's cattle was complete, not just as a crime, but as a statement, as a demonstration of a new kind of power entering the world. Hermes had announced himself to Olympus, not with thunder or lightning, not with war or conquest, but with something far more dangerous, the proof that rules were negotiable, that authority could be challenged, that cunning and intelligence could reshape reality in ways that brute force never could. The baby god had stolen from one of the most powerful immortals in existence, had covered his tracks so thoroughly that even divine investigation failed, and had established himself as a force that would have to be reckoned with on entirely new terms. The world would never quite be the same after that first theft, after that first demonstration that thinking 3 steps ahead could accomplish what strength alone could never achieve. The confrontation between Apollo and Hermes was inevitable, written into the fabric of fate the moment the infant god decided to steal from one of Olympus's most powerful residents. But before we arrive at that moment of reckoning, before we witness the clash between divine truth and divine trickery, we need to understand something crucial about the lyre, that extraordinary instrument that Hermes had already invented before the theft, that tortoise-shell marvel that would ultimately transform a crime into a negotiation and a thief into a god worthy of respect. You may remember from earlier in our story that Hermes, within his first hours of existence, had encountered a mountain tortoise making its slow way across the rocky ground near his mother's cave. Where another newborn might have seen only a curious creature, Hermes saw potential waiting to be realized, an instrument that had not yet been born, but existed somehow in the divine imagination that animated his thoughts. The Homeric hymn tells us that when Hermes found this tortoise feeding on the rich grass before his dwelling, waddling along with that particular unhurried patience that only tortoises possess, he laughed, not with cruelty, but with the recognition that comes when genius encounters the raw materials it needs to manifest something unprecedented. Number 1. Thus speaking, he took up the tortoise in both hands and went back into the house carrying his charming toy, the ancient hymn records, and in those words we find the essence of creation itself. The moment when possibility transforms into action, when the abstract becomes concrete, when the world gains something it did not previously contain. Hermes carried that tortoise into the cave with the kind of focus that transcends age and experience, with hands that should have been clumsy and uncertain, but moved instead with divine precision. Yes. What happened next was an act of creation so swift and confident that it bordered on miraculous, even by the standards of immortal beings who routinely reshaped reality according to their whims. Hermes took up the creature, and, with the swift mercy of someone who understood that hesitation serves no purpose, he ended its life and scooped out the marrow of the mountain tortoise with an iron tool. The shell remained, hollow now, empty, waiting, and Hermes looked at this curved space and saw not absence, but acoustical possibility, resonance chambers, the physics of sound translated into organic architecture. Number. As a swift thought darts through the heart of a man when thronging cares haunt him, or as bright glances flash from the eye, so glorious Hermes planned both thought and deed at once, the hymn tells us, and this comparison is crucial to understanding the nature of his genius. There was no trial and error here, no fumbling experimentation, no gradual refinement of technique. Hermes understood the lyre completely before he had finished constructing it, knew what sounds it would produce before the first string was strung, heard the music in his mind with perfect clarity before physical reality had caught up with divine vision. He found gut strings, perhaps conjured them, perhaps took them from sheep, perhaps used the entrails from the cattle he would later steal and sacrifice, depending on which version of the story you follow, and stretched them across the tortoise shell. 7 strings initially, 1 for each of the Pleiades, the 7 sister stars among whom his mother Maya was numbered. 7 notes, 7 possibilities, 7 pathways through which sound could travel from divine hands into mortal air. The number itself held significance. It represented completeness, cosmic order, the mathematical relationships that underpin harmony and resonance. When he had thus devised the lyre, Hermes also invented the plectrum, that small tool used to pluck the strings, because genius does not stop at creation. It extends to perfecting the method of using what has been created. And then, in the privacy of his mother's cave, while Maya still slept in the exhaustion of new motherhood, Hermes played. The sound that emerged from that tortoise shell must have been unlike anything the universe had previously contained. Not just music, but the birth of music. The first deliberate organization of sound into patterns that spoke directly to the soul without requiring words or explanation. Jew. The lyre sang, and in its singing it announced that the world had changed, that something new had entered existence, that the barrier between silence and expression had been bridged by an instrument that could translate emotion directly into vibration, feeling into frequency, divine inspiration into acoustic reality. Hermes understood immediately what he had created, understood that this was not merely a toy or a distraction, but a form of power as potent as any weapon, as valuable as any treasure. Music, he had discovered, could move the soul in ways that force never could penetrate defenses that no amount of strength could breach, could transform anger into wonder and suspicion into acceptance. This understanding would prove crucial, because Apollo, god of the sun, of prophecy, of truth, was about to become a problem that required solving. The sun god's search for his stolen cattle had been long and frustrating, as we discussed earlier, a journey through confusion and impossibility that left even divine omniscience baffled and angry. Apollo had followed false trails and contradictory evidence, had stood outside caves where his stolen property was hidden without being able to prove they were there, had encountered tracks that led in impossible directions and footprints that belonged to creatures that should not exist. But eventually, whether through prophetic vision that finally pierced through Hermes' deceptions, or through testimony from witnesses who had seen the infant god driving cattle through the night, or simply through the logical process of elimination that pointed toward Mount Silene as the only remaining possibility, Apollo learned the identity of the thief. Tare. Imagine his reaction. The the god of truth and light. One of the most powerful and respected residents of Olympus had been robbed by a newborn, by an infant barely a day old, by the youngest and least established of Zeus's countless illegitimate children. The insult was almost worse than the theft itself. It suggested that Apollo had been careless, that his reputation for omniscience was undeserved, that even a baby could outwit him if that baby possessed sufficient cunning. The rage that filled Apollo as he made his way to Mount Selene was not the hot fury of momentary anger, but rather the cold determination of a powerful being who has been embarrassed and intends to extract full retribution. Bassi. When Apollo arrived at Maia's cave, he found exactly what Hermes had intended him to find: an innocent scene of domestic tranquility, a new mother tending to her infant son, nothing to suggest crime or conspiracy or grand theft. Hermes lay in his cradle, wrapped in his swaddling cloths, the very picture of helpless infancy. His eyes were wide and clear, his expression one of perfect guileless innocence, and when Apollo accused him of stealing the sacred cattle, Hermes responded with denials so smooth and confident that they would have been convincing if Apollo had not already possessed evidence of the crime. How could I steal your cattle?" Hermes seemed to ask, his voice carrying that particular tone of wounded innocence that only the truly guilty can perfect. "I am but a newborn, barely able to walk, certainly incapable of driving 50 animals across vast distances and concealing them so thoroughly that even a god of prophecy cannot find them. Look at me. Do I appear to be a cattle thief? Your accusations are unjust, your suspicions unfounded, and I am frankly hurt that you would storm into my mother's home and level such charges against an innocent infant." The performance was magnificent, a masterclass in deflection and misdirection, but Apollo was not convinced. He had come too far, searched too long, grown too frustrated to be deterred by mere protestations of innocence, no matter how smoothly delivered. The confrontation escalated, voices rising in Maia's cave, divine anger meeting divine stubbornness, until it became clear that this dispute required arbitration at the highest level. Apollo, exercising his authority as one of the senior Olympians, demanded that the matter be brought before Zeus himself, that the king of gods should judge between them and determine the truth. My all. And so the two gods, one ancient and powerful, burning with righteous fury, the other newborn and cunning, wrapped in apparent innocence, made their way to Olympus, to the great palace in the clouds where Zeus held court, and rendered judgment on matters both trivial and cosmic. The journey itself must have been extraordinary. Apollo striding ahead with barely contained rage, Hermes following behind with that peculiar mixture of confidence and calculation that suggested he already knew how this would end, that he had planned for precisely this eventuality. Zeus, watching his newest son approach accompanied by an angry Apollo, must have felt that particular mixture of pride and exasperation that comes from recognizing one's own qualities reflected in one's offspring. Here was clear evidence that Hermes had inherited his father's capacity for strategic thinking, for bending rules without quite breaking them, for achieving desired outcomes through methods that existed in the grey areas between legal and illegal, proper and improper, acceptable and outrageous. The trial, if we can call it that, began with Apollo presenting his case, laying out the evidence of the theft, the missing cattle, the impossible tracks, the eventual trail that led to Hermes. The sun god spoke with the authority of absolute certainty, secure in the knowledge that truth was on his side, that justice must surely rule in his favor, that even Zeus could not ignore such blatant criminality. And Hermes, still maintaining his pose of wounded innocence, continued to deny everything with such smooth confidence that the assembled gods must have marveled at his audacity. But Zeus, who could see through deception when he chose to, who had practiced his own share of trickery during his long reign, was not fooled by his son's performance. He looked at Hermes with eyes that knew guilt when they saw it, with the wisdom that comes from millennia of judging disputes and weighing evidence. "Show Apollo where you have hidden his cattle," Zeus commanded, and the authority in his voice made clear that this was not a request, but an absolute decree that left no room for further evasion. Hermes, recognizing that the game had reached its conclusion, that further denials would serve no purpose, finally abandoned his pretense of innocence. But, and this is crucial, he did not simply surrender, did not meekly lead Apollo to the hidden herd and accept whatever punishment the sun god deemed appropriate. Instead, with that same strategic brilliance that had characterized every action since his birth, Hermes prepared to transform defeat into negotiation, to convert a criminal conviction into an exchange of value that would leave both parties satisfied. He led Apollo to Pylos, to the secluded cave where the stolen cattle were hidden, their tracks still pointing backward in that final brilliant deception. The animals were there, of course, minus the two that Hermes had sacrificed to the gods, minus perhaps the one he had given to the faithless vintner before turning him to stone. Apollo saw his property restored to him and felt his anger begin to cool slightly, tempered by relief and by grudging admiration for the sheer audacity and cleverness required to pull off such a theft. But before Apollo could simply reclaim his cattle and depart, before the matter could be resolved through simple restitution, Hermes reached for the lyre that he had brought with him. That tortoise-shell instrument that represented his first invention, his first act of genuine creation to balance against his first act of theft. He held it in his small hands with the confidence of a master musician, despite the fact that he had been alive for barely more than a day, despite the fact that the instrument itself was only hours old. And then Hermes began to play. The sound that emerged from the lyre was not merely music, it was revelation, it was the demonstration of possibility. It was the proof that beauty could be created from simple materials through nothing more than understanding and intention. The 7 strings sang under Hermes' fingers, producing harmonies and melodies that no one present had ever heard before, because no one in the entire universe had ever played a lyre before this moment. The notes cascaded and interwove, creating patterns of sound that spoke directly to something deeper than rational thought, that bypassed logic and argument, and spoke instead to the part of consciousness that responds to beauty without needing to understand it. Tach, Apollo, god of music himself, master of the singing arts, patron of poets and bards, stood transfixed. The anger that had driven him across Greece in search of his stolen cattle, that had sustained him through days of frustration and dead ends, that had brought him to Zeus demanding justice, began to dissipate like morning mist under sunlight. He had come to this cave expecting to reclaim his property and perhaps extract some additional penalty from the thief who had embarrassed him so thoroughly. Instead, he found himself encountering something unprecedented, something that had not existed in the world before this moment, an instrument capable of producing sounds so pure, so perfectly harmonized, so inherently beautiful, that they seemed to justify their own existence without requiring any additional purpose. The lyre continued to sing, and Hermes continued to play, and gradually the entire character of the confrontation transformed. What had been a criminal matter became instead an artistic demonstration, a showcase of innovation and creativity that transcended questions of property and theft. Apollo, whose domain included music and poetry, who understood better than anyone the value of artistic creation, found his priorities shifting with each note that resonated from the tortoise shell. When the song finally ended, when the last vibrations faded into silence and only memory remained, Apollo spoke, but not with anger anymore, not with demands for punishment or restitution. Instead, he made an offer that surprised everyone present, perhaps even himself. He would trade the cattle for the lyre. All of them, the entire herd, the sacred property whose theft had set this entire chain of events in motion, in exchange for the tortoiseshell instrument and the beautiful sounds it could produce. Hermes, who had been planning and calculating since the moment of his birth, who had stolen the cattle specifically to feed himself and establish his reputation, who had covered his tracks with such elaborate care, now found himself in possession of something far more valuable than livestock. He had Apollo's attention, Apollo's admiration, and, most importantly, Apollo's willingness to negotiate as an equal rather than simply punishing him as a criminal. But Hermes, being Hermes, did not immediately accept the offer. Instead, he negotiated. Because why settle for a simple trade when you could extract additional concessions, additional benefits, additional recognition of your worth and abilities? The exact details of the negotiation are lost to time, obscured by different accounts and varying traditions. But we know that when the discussion concluded, Hermes had secured far more than simple forgiveness for his theft. Apollo took the lyre and placed it in his left hand, trying each string with practiced expertise, despite never having played this particular instrument before. Awesomely it sounded at the touch of the god, the Homeric hymn records, and in those words we understand that the lyre had found its true home, that Apollo's divine musicianship was perfectly suited to extract every bit of beauty and complexity that the instrument could produce. He sang sweetly to its note, and the assembled gods understood that something fundamental had shifted in the cosmos, that a new form of artistic expression had been added to the world's possibilities. From this point forward, the lyre would be associated primarily with Apollo, identified as his instrument, celebrated in art and poetry as the tool through which the god of music expressed his divine artistry. Statues and paintings would show Apollo with the lyre. Temples would feature images of the sun god playing the tortoise-shell instrument, and the invention itself would be attributed to various sources, sometimes to Apollo himself, sometimes to Hermes, sometimes to other figures entirely, because memory is fluid and attribution matters less than the beauty of the music produced. But those who knew the true story, who remembered the details of that extraordinary first day of Hermes' life, understood that the lyre was fundamentally a product of cunning and creativity combined, born from theft and transformed into art, created by a newborn god who understood that survival in Olympus required not just power, but rather the ability to produce value, to create things that others wanted badly enough to forgive transgressions and welcome you into their company. The exchange of the lyre for the cattle represented more than just a property transaction. It was the establishment of a relationship between two gods who would, from this point forward, be linked in ways both practical and symbolic. Apollo gained an instrument that would become central to his identity and his worship, a tool through which he could express the divine harmony that he represented. Hermes gained something equally valuable, recognition as a legitimate member of the Olympian family, acknowledgement that his cleverness and creativity were worthy of respect rather than merely punishment, and most importantly, the friendship, or at least the acceptance, of one of Olympus's most powerful residents. Zeus, watching this resolution unfold, must have been pleased with how his newest son had handled himself. Yes, Hermes had committed theft, but he had also demonstrated intelligence, creativity, strategic thinking, and the ability to transform a bad situation into a mutually beneficial outcome. These were qualities that Zeus valued highly, qualities that had served him well throughout his own rise to power and his long reign as king of gods. In Hermes, Zeus saw not just another illegitimate child to be managed and placated, but rather a useful tool, an agent of divine will who could operate in the grey areas where the more straightforward gods feared or refused to tread. The bond between Apollo and Hermes, forged in this strange mixture of theft and artistry, would prove remarkably durable. In future myths and stories we find them working together, complementing each other's strengths, representing different but equally valid approaches to divine power. Apollo was truth, light, prophecy, order, the god who revealed what was hidden and illuminated what was dark. Hermes was cunning, communication, crossing boundaries, negotiation, the god who moved between realms and translated between different modes of understanding. Together, they represented a kind of completeness, a balance between revelation and concealment, between direct confrontation and strategic maneuvering, between the truth that cannot be denied and the interpretation that shapes how truth is understood. And it all began with a stolen herd of cattle, a tortoise-shell lyre, and a song so beautiful that it transformed anger into admiration and made a thief into a respected member of the divine family. The lyre itself would go on to have its own storied existence, eventually passing to Orpheus according to some traditions, becoming associated with constellations and cosmic harmony, serving as the instrument through which some of the most beautiful music in all of Greek mythology would be played. But its origin remained clear to those who remembered. It was born from the mind of Hermes, created in the first hours of his extraordinary life, fashioned from a tortoise shell and gut strings by hands that should have been too young and weak to accomplish anything significant. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the lyre's invention, that creation and destruction are sometimes intertwined, that beauty can emerge from unlikely materials, that genius manifests not in following established patterns, but rather in seeing possibilities that no one else has recognized. The tortoise died so that the lyre could be born. The cattle were stolen so that the music could be heard, and the laws of property and respect were violated so that a new form of artistic expression could enter the world. Hermes, in inventing the lyre, had done something more profound than simply creating a musical instrument. He had demonstrated that intelligence and creativity could negotiate with power, that beauty could serve as currency in transactions between gods, that the ability to produce something unprecedented and valuable could transform one's entire position in the cosmic hierarchy. He had shown that when you cannot compete with others in terms of age, established authority, or raw power, you can instead compete by being the one who invents what everyone else suddenly realizes they cannot live without. Apollo, for all his initial anger and sense of violated justice, understood this principle intuitively once he heard the lyre's music. He recognized that possessing this instrument was worth more than reclaiming his cattle, worth more than punishing the thief, worth more than maintaining his dignity through insisting on strict justice. The lyre represented something new in the world, and Apollo, god of civilization and culture, patron of the arts, could not resist the opportunity to claim it as his own, to master it, to make it central to his divine identity. And so, the confrontation that should have ended in punishment concluded instead with exchange and recognition, with Hermes keeping his life and gaining respect, with Apollo gaining an instrument that would define him for eternity, and with the world gaining a new form of beauty that would echo through temples and theatres for millennia to come. The tortoise that had been waddling peacefully across the ground near Maya's cave, minding its own business in the innocent way that animals do, had been transformed into immortal music, its shell outlasting its flesh by countless generations, its involuntary sacrifice remembered in every song played on every lyre throughout human history. Hermes returned to Mount Selene with his reputation established and his position secure, no longer just another illegitimate offspring of Zeus's countless affairs, but rather a god who had proven himself worthy of respect through demonstrating capabilities that complemented rather than competed with the existing Olympian hierarchy. He had stolen from Apollo and gotten away with it, not through escaping detection, but through converting discovery into negotiation and negotiation into mutual benefit. He had committed a crime and emerged not as a criminal, but as an artist, an inventor, a valuable addition to the divine family. The lyre sang on in Apollo's hands, producing music that would inspire poets and musicians for generations. And in that music was the echo of Hermes's first great lesson to the world, that rules exist to be interpreted, that problems exist to be solved creatively, and that sometimes the best way to escape punishment for taking something is to give something even more valuable in return. The resolution of the cattle theft marked a turning point not just in Hermes's personal narrative, but in the very structure of Olympian governance. Zeus, watching his youngest son navigate the confrontation with Apollo transforming theft into trade, crime into creativity, punishment into partnership, recognized something that the other gods were only beginning to understand. that Hermes possessed a unique combination of qualities that made him invaluable for tasks that required more than simple divine power. The king of gods needed a messenger, an intermediary, someone who could move between realms and carry his commands with speed, intelligence, and the diplomatic flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. And standing before him, barely more than a day old but already proving himself capable of extraordinary feats, was the perfect candidate. The appointment of Hermes as the official messenger and herald of the gods was not simply a matter of assigning duties to a junior member of the divine family. It represented a fundamental recognition that communication itself required specialization, that the transmission of information between Olympus and the mortal world, between gods of different temperaments and priorities, between the living and the dead, demanded someone whose very nature aligned with crossing boundaries and navigating complex social landscapes. Hermes had demonstrated in his first day of existence that he understood how to read situations, how to anticipate responses, how to transform disadvantageous positions into negotiated settlements that left all parties feeling they had gained something valuable. These were precisely the skills required of someone who would serve as the interface between Zeus's will and its implementation across multiple realms of existence. Zeus bestowed upon Hermes the symbols of his new office gifts that would become so intimately associated with him that centuries of art and literature would never depict him without them. First came the patron, a broad-brimmed hat designed to protect travelers from sun and rain, marking Hermes as the god of journeys and roads, the patron of all those who ventured from familiar territory into unknown lands. Then the lyre, those famous winged sandals that would allow him to move with supernatural speed, to traverse the distance between Olympus and Earth in moments, to appear suddenly wherever his presence was required and depart just as quickly when his mission was complete. The wings themselves, sometimes depicted as sprouting from the sandals, sometimes from his ankles, sometimes even from his cap, represented more than mere velocity. They symbolized freedom from the normal constraints of geography and gravity, the ability to exist outside the limitations that bound even other immortals to relatively predictable patterns of movement. But perhaps most significant was the herald's wand, the staff that would eventually become known as the caduceus, a rod entwined with two serpents, often topped with wings, representing Hermes' authority to speak on behalf of Zeus and the other gods, his power to negotiate and create agreements, his capacity to move between hostile territories under the protection of diplomatic immunity. The caduceus was not a weapon in the conventional sense, though it possessed its own forms of power. It could induce sleep, could wake the sleeping, could guide the dead and pacify the living, could open doors that were closed and close pathways that were open. It was the physical manifestation of Hermes' role as someone who existed at thresholds and transitions, who operated in the liminal spaces between one state and another. With these gifts and this commission, Hermes became something unprecedented in the divine hierarchy. Not the strongest god, not the wisest, not the most beautiful or terrible, but rather the most mobile, the most adaptable, the one whose very purpose required him to exist in multiple places and fulfill multiple roles simultaneously. He was the herald who announced Zeus's decisions, the messenger who carried divine commands to mortals and reports back to Olympus, the diplomat who negotiated on behalf of the gods when direct confrontation would be counterproductive, the guide who shepherded souls from the world of the living to the realm of the dead. No other god possessed such breadth of responsibility, such freedom of movement, such necessity to understand and navigate the perspectives of so many different constituencies. The speed that Hermes demonstrated in his role as messenger was not merely physical velocity, though that was certainly part of it. Stories tell of him traversing the distance from Olympus to Earth faster than thought itself, appearing at the sites of mortal conflicts or divine interventions almost before Zeus had finished formulating the message he wanted delivered. But the deeper speed was cognitive, the ability to assess situations instantly, to understand what needed to be communicated and how best to frame it for maximum effectiveness, to anticipate objections and prepare responses before questions were even asked. Hermes brought to his role as messenger the same strategic intelligence that had allowed him to steal Apollo's cattle and escape detection. He understood that successful communication was never simply about transmitting information, but rather about understanding the recipient's perspective and adjusting the delivery to ensure the message would be received and acted upon in the desired manner. Double Zeus came to rely on Hermes in ways that went far beyond simple message delivery. When the king of gods needed someone to execute delicate missions that required discretion and cunning rather than overwhelming force, he turned to his youngest son. When diplomatic situations threatened to escalate into conflicts that would disrupt the careful balance of power on Olympus or create complications in the mortal world, Hermes was dispatched to negotiate settlements and broker compromises. When Zeus's many romantic entanglements created situations that required careful management, and such situations arose with remarkable frequency, given Zeus's proclivities, Hermes served as his father's most trusted agent and accomplice. The myths preserve numerous examples of Hermes fulfilling these duties with characteristic cleverness and efficiency. When Zeus fell in love with the priestess Io and Hera discovered the affair, transforming the unfortunate woman into a cow and setting the hundred-eyed giant Argus Panoptes to watch over her and prevent Zeus from continuing his attentions, it was Hermes who Zeus commanded to free Io from her bovine imprisonment. The task was formidable. Argus possessed 100 eyes that never all slept simultaneously, making it impossible to approach without being observed, and the giant had been specifically instructed by Hera to maintain constant vigilance. But Hermes, employing the same combination of patience and strategic deception that had served him so well in the cattle theft, appeared before Argus in the guise of a simple shepherd and began to tell stories, to play music on his pipes, to gradually lull the giant's many eyes into closure one by one. When all 100 eyes had finally succumbed to sleep, a feat that required hours of sustained performance and psychological manipulation, Hermes struck swiftly, beheading Argus and freeing Io from her captivity. The act earned him the epithet Argifontes, the slayer of Argus, a title that would be attached to his name throughout Greek literature, as a reminder that the messenger god could be as deadly as he was diplomatic when circumstances required it. But Hermes' role as messenger extended beyond serving Zeus's personal interests. He became the voice of divine will, the channel through which Olympian decisions reached the mortal world and through which mortal prayers and offerings reached divine attention. When the gods decreed that a hero must undertake a quest, Hermes was often the one who appeared to deliver the commission, to explain what was required and why, to provide the guidance and sometimes the tools that would make success possible. When Perseus needed to slay the Gorgon Medusa, but lacked the knowledge of how to find her or the equipment to survive the encounter, Hermes appeared to guide him first to the Graeae, those ancient sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them, and then provided Perseus with some of the divine implements he would need for his quest. The god's assistance went beyond mere message delivery. He served as mentor and facilitator, ensuring that the tasks assigned by Zeus or fate could actually be accomplished by mortals whose capabilities fell far short of divine power. Similarly, when Odysseus found himself trapped on Circe's island, his men transformed into swine by the enchantress's magic, facing a situation that mortal wit alone could not overcome. Hermes appeared with a solution, the magical herb moly, which would protect Odysseus from Circe's sorcery, and allow him to negotiate from a position of strength rather than as another victim to be transformed. The intervention was characteristic of Hermes' approach to his duties. He did not solve problems directly through overwhelming divine power, but rather provided the tools and knowledge that allowed mortals to solve their own problems, maintaining the essential distinction between human agency and divine intervention, while still ensuring that outcomes aligned with Olympian interests. when King Priam of Troy sought to ransom the body of his son Hector from Achilles, a mission that required him to travel alone through hostile Greek camps filled with warriors who would gladly kill him on sight, to face the demigod who had slain his son in single combat and dragged the corpse behind his chariot in rage and grief. It was Hermes who guided him safely through the darkness, who ensured he reached Achilles' tent unharmed, who helped facilitate the conversation that would allow the aged king to successfully plead for his son's body and return with it to Troy for proper burial. The mission required not just safe passage but emotional intelligence, the ability to soften hearts hardened by years of war, to find the pathway through anger and pride to grief and recognition of shared humanity. These were precisely the qualities that Hermes excelled at employing. The capacity to navigate not just physical distances but emotional and psychological barriers. The role of messenger also meant that Hermes became intimately familiar with mortal affairs in ways that many of the more remote Olympians never achieved. While Zeus thundered from Olympus and Apollo illuminated from the sky and Poseidon raged in the depths of the sea, Hermes walked the roads of the mortal world, encountered travelers and merchants and shepherds and thieves in their ordinary contexts, understood the rhythms and concerns of human life, not as abstract concepts but as lived reality. This constant movement between divine and mortal realms gave him a perspective that few other gods possessed. He could translate Olympian priorities into terms that mortals could understand and act upon, and he could explain mortal motivations and limitations to gods who had never experienced hunger or fear or the urgency that comes from knowing your existence is finite. His association with roads and travel was natural given his role as messenger, but it extended beyond simple geography. Hermes became the patron deity of all those who journeyed. Merchants travelling with goods to distant markets, soldiers marching to war, pilgrims seeking sacred sites, refugees fleeing disaster, adventurers pursuing fortune in unknown lands. Stone markers called Hermes pillars featuring Hermes' head, and often his phallus as well, symbolizing fertility and protection, were erected at crossroads and boundaries throughout the Greek world, marking transitions between territories and offering the gods protection to those passing by. Travelers would leave offerings at these markers, prayers for safe journey and profitable ventures, acknowledgements that movement through space always carried risk, and that divine favour might mean the difference between success and disaster. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hermes' role as messenger was his unique ability to cross the ultimate boundary, the division between life and death, between the mortal world and the underworld ruled by Hades. While other gods could visit the underworld if necessary, it was not their natural domain, and they entered it as visitors navigating foreign territory. Hermes alone moved freely between all three realms, Olympus, Earth, and the underworld, without restriction or difficulty, as comfortable guiding the souls of the dead to their final destination as he was carrying Zeus's commands to mortal kings. This role, as Psychopomp, conductor of souls, was central to his identity and essential to the functioning of the cosmic order. When mortals died, their souls did not simply drift to the underworld automatically. They required guidance, someone to lead them through the transition from embodied life to disembodied existence, to navigate the pathways that connected the living world to Hades' realm. Hermes performed this duty for all the dead, from the greatest heroes to the most ordinary people, treating each soul with the same efficiency and care regardless of their mortal status or achievements. He was not a judge of the dead, that role belonged to others, to Minos and Rhadamanthys and Iacchus who weighed deeds and assigned fates, but rather the guide who ensured that souls reached the point where judgment could occur. The mechanics of this guidance are preserved in various myths and artistic depictions. Hermes would appear to the newly dead, often depicted in vase paintings as using his caduceus to rouse or summon souls, and would lead them on the journey to the underworld's entrance. Some accounts speak of him physically escorting individual souls, while others suggest he guided groups of the dead, like a shepherd herding his flock, and indeed, one of his many epithets was Creophoros, the ram-bearer, referring to his role as protector of shepherds and flocks, both mortal and spiritual. The journey would take them to the river Styx, where Charon the ferryman would transport them across the waters that separated the living world from the realm of the dead, with Hermes remaining present to ensure the transition was completed properly. This role gave Hermes a unique perspective on mortality itself. He witnessed every death, saw the moment when life transitioned to whatever came after, understood in ways that other immortals could not the fundamental difference between his own eternal existence and the finite nature of mortal life. It also meant he developed relationships with the gods of the underworld, with Hades and Persephone, that were more collegial than fearful. He was a regular presence in their realm, not as an intruder or supplicant, but as someone performing essential duties that supported the order of existence itself. When Persephone needed to be retrieved from the underworld after Demeter's grief at her daughter's abduction threatened to destroy all life on Earth through eternal winter, it was Hermes who Zeus sent to negotiate her release and guide her back to the surface. When Orpheus attempted to rescue his beloved Eurydice from death through the power of his music, succeeding in winning Hades' agreement that she could return to life if Orpheus could lead her out without looking back, the journey back toward the light was made in Hermes' presence, under his guidance, though ultimately Orpheus' failure to trust and his fatal backward glance occurred despite, or perhaps because of the god's attendance. These were delicate missions requiring not just the ability to traverse the boundary between life and death, but the diplomatic skill to negotiate with the underworld's rulers, to navigate the complex rules that governed what could and could not leave their domain. The trust that Zeus placed in Hermes extended to using him for tasks that required absolute discretion and political sensitivity. When Pandora was created, the first woman, designed as a punishment for humanity's acceptance of Prometheus's stolen fire, beautiful but filled with evils that would plague mankind forever, it was Hermes who escorted her to Epimetheus and ensured she was accepted into the mortal world, setting in motion the chain of events that would result in suffering and hardship entering human existence. The mission required someone who could present catastrophe as gift, who could make the cursed seem blessed, who possessed sufficient charm and persuasive ability to ensure that Epimetheus would accept Pandora, despite his brother Prometheus's warnings to refuse all gifts from the gods. When the three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, needed someone to guide them to Mount Ida, where Paris would judge which of them was fairest in the contest that would eventually trigger the Trojan War, Hermes served as their escort, navigating the delicate politics of transporting three powerful and competitive deities while maintaining sufficient neutrality that none felt slighted or disadvantaged. The role required diplomatic sophistication of the highest order. These were not ordinary travelers requiring simple guidance, but rather embodiments of divine power, whose egos and priorities could reshape history, and any perceived favoritism or slight could have cosmic consequences. The relationship between Hermes and Zeus evolved into something approaching partnership, not between equals certainly, as Zeus remained the supreme authority and Hermes his servant, but rather a collaboration based on mutual understanding and complementary capabilities. Zeus possessed ultimate power, but often lacked the subtlety or patience to achieve his objectives through indirect means. Hermes possessed the cunning and flexibility to accomplish, through deception and diplomacy, what could not be achieved through direct command. Together they formed a governance structure that combined authority with implementation, vision with execution, command with persuasion. The other Olympians came to accept and even appreciate Hermes' unique position. While some gods operated within narrow domains, Hephaestus in his forge, Aphrodite in matters of love, Ares in warfare, Demeter in agriculture. Hermes' responsibilities required him to understand and interact with all domains, to serve as a bridge between different divine interests and priorities. This made him valuable as a mediator when conflicts arose between gods, as someone who could negotiate settlements that preserved everyone's dignity and interests while serving Zeus's ultimate objectives. His role as herald meant he was present at important gatherings, witness to divine decisions and debates, positioned to offer counsel when his perspective was needed, while maintaining the discretion necessary to keep confidences and manage sensitive information. The mortal world came to worship Hermes not just as Zeus's messenger, but as a god who directly impacted their lives through his various domains of influence. Merchants prayed to him for profitable ventures, asking his blessing on their goods and safe passage for their trading expeditions. Thieves claimed him as their patron, recognizing in his first day of cattle theft a divine validation of cunning and stealth as legitimate forms of survival and success. Travelers left offerings at crossroads, seeking his protection on dangerous roads. Athletes invoked his name before competitions, as he was associated with gymnasiums and athletic contests, his speed and agility serving as inspiration for human physical excellence. Shepherds asked him to protect their flocks, remembering his ancient association with pastoral life and animal husbandry. Even language and writing fell under his domain, as communication in all its forms naturally connected to his role as messenger. The Greeks understood that the ability to convey meaning through words, whether spoken or written, was itself a form of crossing boundaries, of moving ideas from one mind to another, of translating internal thoughts into external expressions that others could receive and understand. Hermes became associated with eloquence and persuasion, with the rhetorical skills that allowed speakers to convince audiences and writers to move readers, with the interpretive abilities required to understand messages correctly and convey them accurately. Postica. His influence extended to commercial transactions and contracts, to the negotiations and agreements that made trade and commerce possible. The caduceus, his staff with its intertwined serpents, became a symbol not just of his divine authority, but of commerce itself, representing the exchanges and negotiations that characterized market activity. Merchants would swear oaths by Hermes, invoking him as witness to their agreements, trusting that the god who served as herald and messenger would recognize the sacred nature of promises and commitments. The paradox of Hermes was that he served as both the god who protected honest travelers and merchants, ensuring fair dealing and safe passage, and simultaneously the patron of thieves and tricksters who violated those same principles. This apparent contradiction made perfect sense within his nature. He was the god of boundaries and boundary crossing, which meant he necessarily operated on both sides of any divide. He understood law because he also understood how to circumvent it. He protected property because he also knew how to steal it. He ensured honest communication because he also mastered deception. This dual nature made him uniquely qualified to serve as Zeus's messenger and agent, because he could navigate any situation regardless of its ethical complexity, could operate in grey areas where more straightforward gods would be paralyzed by principle or precedent. The freedom of movement that Hermes enjoyed, his ability to traverse Olympus, Earth, and the underworld without restriction, symbolized a larger freedom from the constraints that limited other gods. He was not bound to a specific location like Hephaestus to his forge or Poseidon to the sea. He was not committed to a single virtue like Athena, to wisdom, or Artemis to chastity. He was not consumed by a particular passion like Ares with war, or Aphrodite with love. Instead, his very nature was defined by movement, transition, adaptation, the ability to be whatever was needed in whatever context he found himself. This made him indispensable to Zeus, but also somewhat unpredictable, because a god whose essence is crossing boundaries can never be fully contained by expectations or precedents. The winged sandals that carried him swiftly between realms became perhaps the most iconic visual representation of divine speed and freedom in all of Greek mythology. Artists depicted him in mid-flight, his feet barely touching the ground, his body angled forward in perpetual motion, the small wings at his ankles beating so rapidly they blurred into suggestions of movement rather than distinct feathers. The image captured something essential about his nature. He was always between places rather than anchored in any single location, always in the process of arriving or departing, always oriented toward the next destination rather than settled in the present moment. This quality of perpetual motion, of existing primarily in transition rather than stasis, made Hermes the god who most directly understood and embodied change itself. While other gods represented stable principles or domains, justice, love, war, wisdom, the harvest, Hermes represented transformation, the process of becoming rather than the state of being, the journey rather than the destination. In this sense, his role as messenger was not just about carrying information, but about being the agent of change, the catalyst through which static situations transformed into new configurations. When he arrived with a message from Zeus, he was not simply delivering data, but rather initiating a cascade of consequences that would reshape whatever situation he encountered. The trust that the other gods placed in Hermes to perform these duties, despite his well-established capacity for trickery and his origins as a cattle thief, speaks to a recognition that his cunning served rather than threatened the cosmic order. Yes, he could deceive, but his deceptions were employed in service of Zeus's will and the maintenance of divine authority over the mortal world. Yes, he could steal, but his thefts were sanctioned, or at least forgiven, as expressions of his essential nature, the same nature that made him so effective at accomplishing tasks that required subtlety and indirection. The gods understood that having Hermes as ally was far preferable to having him as adversary, and that his position as Zeus's trusted messenger ensured his considerable talents were directed toward maintaining rather than disrupting the established order. In becoming messenger of the gods, Hermes found the perfect expression of his nature, the role that allowed his speed, intelligence, cunning, eloquence and boundary-crossing abilities to serve a purpose larger than himself, while still exercising the freedom and flexibility that characterized his approach to existence. He was no longer just the clever infant who stole cattle and invented instruments, but rather an essential component of how divine will manifested in the world, how communication flowed between realms, how the necessary transitions of life and death were managed and maintained. From his chaotic birth to his mature role as Zeus's indispensable agent, Hermes had become proof that intelligence and adaptability could earn a place in the divine hierarchy as secure as any achieved through strength or beauty or ancient lineage. The domains that came to be associated with Hermes extended far beyond his original role as Zeus's messenger, radiating outward from his core attributes of speed, cunning, and boundary crossing, until they touched nearly every aspect of Greek life that involved transition, exchange, or movement between states. This expansion of influence was not arbitrary or accidental. Each domain connected logically to some fundamental aspect of his nature, some quality that had manifested in those first extraordinary hours of his existence when he escaped his cradle, invented the lyre, and stole Apollo's cattle. The Greeks understood that Hermes represented something essential about how the world actually operated, not through rigid categories and fixed boundaries, but rather through constant negotiation, adaptation, and crossing of lines that others believed to be absolute. One. The roads themselves became sacred to Hermes in ways that went beyond simple patronage of travelers. Throughout the Greek world, at crossroads and boundaries where paths intersected or territories met, the Greeks erected hermes, stone markers that typically featured Hermes's head at the top, and an erect phallus at the center, representing fertility, protection, and the god's potent presence at these liminal spaces. These were not merely decorative monuments or casual dedications, but rather functional objects that served multiple purposes simultaneously. They marked boundaries between territories, providing clear indication of where one realm ended and another began. They offered protection to travelers passing through these vulnerable transition points, places where one left the security of familiar ground and entered unknown territory where danger might lurk. They served as altars where offerings could be left, a prayer for safe journey, a thanksgiving for successful arrival, a request for profitable commerce, a plea for protection from bandits and bad weather, and all the countless hazards that awaited those who ventured beyond their home settlements. The placement of Hermes at crossroads was particularly significant because crossroads represented choice itself, the moment when a traveller must decide which direction to take, which path to follow, which future to pursue. Hermes presided over these moments of decision, these forks in the road, both literal and metaphorical, because his nature encompassed the understanding that most of life consists of navigating uncertain choices with incomplete information. To pray to Hermes at a crossroads was to acknowledge that you did not know for certain which direction was correct, which path would lead to fortune or disaster, but that you needed divine guidance to make the best choice possible, given the limitations of mortal perception and foresight. Travellers of all kinds fell under Hermes's protection. Not just the merchants and traders who would later become so closely associated with him, but anyone who left the safety of home and ventured into the wider world. Soldiers marching to war prayed to Hermes for safe passage through enemy territory and for the cunning to survive encounters with hostile forces. Pilgrims journeying to sacred sites invoked his name, asking that he guide them safely to their destinations and ensure they found hospitable welcome along the way. Refugees fleeing disaster, migrants seeking new homes, adventurers pursuing fortune in distant lands. All of these fell within Hermes's domain because all of them were in motion, crossing boundaries, transitioning from one state of existence to another. The association with hospitality flowed naturally from his role as protector of travelers. In Greek culture, the concept of xenia guest friendship, the sacred obligation to welcome strangers and provide them with food, shelter, and protection, was understood as being under divine supervision, and Hermes was one of the primary gods who enforced this crucial social contract. To turn away a traveller in need was not merely unkind, but rather a violation of sacred duty that could bring divine punishment. Hermes ensured that those who showed proper hospitality were blessed with good fortune, while those who refused to aid travellers found themselves cursed with various misfortunes. The logic was clear. A society where travellers could not trust in receiving basic assistance would be a society where movement became impossible, where commerce and communication and all the exchanges that characterize civilization would grind to a halt. Hermes protected the mechanisms that made movement possible, and hospitality was essential to those mechanisms. But the paradox that characterized so much of Hermes's identity manifested here as well. He was simultaneously the protector of travellers and the patron of those who preyed upon them. Thieves and bandits claimed Hermes as their divine sponsor, recognizing in his theft of Apollo's cattle a validation of taking what belonged to others through stealth and cleverness. The same god who blessed honest merchants with profitable ventures also smiled upon those who robbed those merchants on dark roads. The same deity who punished those who refused hospitality to travellers also protected those who ambushed travellers and stole their possessions. This apparent contradiction troubled some Greeks, who found it difficult to reconcile the moral ambiguity of a god who seemed to endorse both lawful and criminal behaviour simultaneously. But others understood that Hermes represented something more fundamental than conventional morality. He embodied the reality that resources are always moving between different hands through various means, some sanctioned by society and some condemned, but all involving the same basic principle of transfer and exchange. A merchant acquiring goods through purchase and a thief acquiring goods through theft were engaging in fundamentally similar transactions from Hermes's perspective. Both involved cunning, risk assessment, strategic thinking, and the movement of property from one owner to another. The legal status of the transaction mattered deeply to mortals and to gods like Zeus, who maintained cosmic order, but to Hermes, whose domain was the mechanism of exchange itself rather than the moral valuation of that exchange. Both activities fell within his purview. This is not to suggest that Hermes was amoral or that he encouraged crime for its own sake. Rather, He recognized and protected all forms of acquisition and exchange, because his role required him to operate beyond simplistic moral categories, to understand how the world actually functioned rather than how philosophers and priests believed it should function. A thief who successfully stole a valuable object through clever planning and daring execution had demonstrated qualities: intelligence, courage, timing, strategic thinking, that Hermes valued regardless of whether those qualities were being employed in socially sanctioned ways. Commerce and trade became perhaps the most socially acceptable expression of Hermes's domain, the realm where his attributes of cunning, negotiation, and exchange could operate within legal frameworks rather than against them. Merchants prayed to Hermes before embarking on trading expeditions, asking for his blessing on their ventures and his protection for their goods. The marketplace itself, that space where goods and money changed hands through negotiation and agreement, was understood as being under Hermes's supervision. He ensured fair weights and measures when he chose to, but also smiled upon clever merchants who found legal ways to maximize their profits through superior negotiation skills, better information, or more accurate assessment of what buyers truly wanted and what sellers desperately needed to unload. The caduceus, Hermes's staff with its intertwined serpents, became associated with commerce itself, a symbol representing the exchanges and agreements that characterized market transactions. When merchants swore oaths regarding the quality of their goods or their commitment to honor agreements, they swore by Hermes, invoking him as witness to their promises. The god who had demonstrated in his first day of life that he understood the art of negotiation, transforming a criminal charge into a mutually beneficial exchange of cattle for lyre, naturally presided over all the countless negotiations that made economic life possible. Me. Language itself fell under Hermes's protection as an extension of his role as messenger and communicator. The Greeks understood that words were how meaning moved between minds, how thoughts that existed privately in one person's consciousness could be transferred into another person's understanding. This made language itself a form of boundary crossing, a transition between internal and external states, and therefore naturally part of Hermes's domain. Eloquence and persuasion, the ability to use words effectively to convince, inspire, negotiate, deceive, were gifts that Hermes could bestow upon those he favored. Orators preparing to deliver important speeches would pray to Hermes for the words to move their audiences, for the rhetorical skill to make compelling arguments, for the timing and delivery that would maximize the impact of their message. The association with language extended to writing as well, that technology which allowed communication to persist across time and distance without requiring the physical presence of messenger or speaker. Some traditions credited Hermes with inventing the alphabet itself, with creating the system of symbols that could represent spoken sounds and preserve them for future readers. Whether or not he literally invented writing, the connection made logical sense. Writing was the ultimate expression of communication crossing boundaries, allowing messages to move between people who would never meet, between eras separated by generations or centuries, between the living and those long dead whose words persisted in written form. Athletes and those engaged in physical competition claimed Hermes as their patron, recognizing in his supernatural speed and agility an aspiration for human physical excellence. Gymnasiums. Those spaces where Greek men gathered to train their bodies and compete in various athletic contests were often adorned with images of Hermes or featured altars dedicated to him. Young athletes preparing for competition would offer prayers to Hermes, asking him to bless them with speed, agility, strategic thinking during contests, and the quick reflexes needed to respond to opponents' movements. The connection was not merely about physical capability, but also about the mental aspects of competition, the ability to read an opponent's intentions, to anticipate what would happen next, to make split-second decisions that mean the difference between victory and defeat. These qualities aligned perfectly with Hermes' nature as the god who thought faster than others, who planned several moves ahead, who understood how to gain advantage through superior intelligence combined with physical capability. The pastoral aspects of Hermes' identity connected him to shepherds and those who tended flocks, an association that may have been among his oldest domains, predating even his incorporation into the Olympian family. Hermes Creophorus, the ram-bearer, was depicted in art carrying a lamb or ram across his shoulders, representing his role as protector of shepherds and their animals. This imagery would later be adopted by Christianity to represent the Good Shepherd, but its origins lay in Hermes' ancient connection to pastoral life and animal husbandry. Shepherds moving their flocks between seasonal grazing grounds, crossing territorial boundaries and navigating uncertain terrain, naturally fell under the protection of the god who presided over journeys and transitions. Thus, the fertility of flocks was also part of his domain. Prayers to Hermes asked that sheep produce healthy offspring, that herds multiply and prosper, that the pastoral economy, which formed such a crucial part of Greek agricultural life, remain productive and sustainable. This aspect of his identity connected to the phallic imagery of the Hermes, those boundary markers which represented not just protection but also generative power, the capacity to produce new life and sustain existing populations. But perhaps Hermes' most profound domain was his role as Psychopomp, the guide who conducted souls from the world of the living to the realm of the dead. This was the ultimate boundary crossing, the final transition that every mortal would eventually experience, and Hermes alone among the Olympians moved freely between the living world and Hades' domain to perform this essential duty. When a person died, their soul did not simply drift to the underworld automatically. It required guidance, someone to lead it through the transition, to navigate the pathways that connected life to death, to ensure the soul reached its proper destination rather than becoming lost or trapped between realms. The mechanics of this guidance varied somewhat in different accounts, but the essential role remained consistent. Hermes appeared to the newly dead and escorted them on their final journey. Vase paintings frequently depict this scene, Hermes with his caduceus, leading groups of souls or individual shades toward the river Styx, where Charon the ferryman would transport them across the waters that separated the living world from the realm of the dead. The imagery shows Hermes sometimes using his staff to rouse or summon souls, sometimes simply leading them like a shepherd guiding his flock, maintaining his presence throughout the transition to ensure it completed properly. This role gave Hermes a unique perspective that no other Olympian possessed. He witnessed every death, saw the moment when consciousness departed the body, and whatever remained began its journey to judgment and final disposition. He encountered souls of every kind, heroes and cowards, the righteous and the wicked, the old who had lived full lives and the young whose time was cut tragically short. He guided them all with the same efficiency and care, because his role was not to judge but rather to transport, not to determine fates but rather to ensure souls reached the place where their fates would be determined by others. This constant exposure to mortality, to the transition between life and death, to the moment when all the striving and struggling of embodied existence ended and only the essential soul remained, must have shaped Hermes' understanding of existence in ways that other immortals could not fully grasp. While Zeus thundered from Olympus and Apollo illuminated from the sky, Hermes walked beside the dying and the dead, understanding in ways that those who had never experienced mortality could not quite comprehend the fragility and preciousness of finite existence. The role of Psychopomp also connected Hermes to the mystery religions, those secret cults that promised initiates knowledge about death and what came after. Because he alone moved freely between the worlds of living and dead, because he had seen what awaited souls after their bodies failed, Hermes possessed knowledge that mortals desperately wanted to access. The Eleusinian mysteries and other mystery traditions invoked Hermes as someone who could provide guidance not just in the physical journey to the underworld, but in understanding what that journey meant, how to prepare for it, what awaited on the other side. his role-guiding souls, also meant that Hermes developed relationships with the gods of the underworld that were fundamentally different from those of other Olympians. While most gods viewed the underworld with some combination of fear, distaste, or disinterest, it was Hades' domain, dark and forbidding, associated with death and decay. Hermes was a regular presence there, someone who understood its geography and inhabitants, who could navigate its rules and politics. Hades and Persephone knew him as someone performing essential duties that supported the cosmic order, delivering souls that needed to reach their realm, occasionally carrying messages between the underworld and Olympus when communication between those realms became necessary. This comfortable familiarity with death and the dead made Hermes uniquely qualified to assist heroes whose quests required them to journey to the underworld while still living. An extraordinarily dangerous undertaking that violated the natural order and required divine assistance to accomplish successfully. When Heracles was assigned the labor of capturing Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to Hades' realm, Hermes guided him on the journey into the underworld and helped ensure he could return to the living world afterward. When Odysseus needed to consult the shade of the prophet Tiresias, who could provide crucial information about his troubled journey home, it was Hermes who provided the knowledge and protection necessary to communicate with the dead without becoming trapped among them. The assistance Hermes provided to heroes extended beyond underworld journeys to encompass any situation where intelligence, cunning, and strategic gifts could make the difference between success and failure. Perseus, tasked with the seemingly impossible challenge of slaying Medusa, whose gaze turned any who looked upon her into stone, received guidance and gifts from Hermes that made the quest achievable rather than suicidal. Hermes directed Perseus to the Graeae, those ancient sisters who shared a single eye between them and possessed knowledge of where the Gorgons could be found. He provided or helped Perseus obtain the winged sandals that allowed him to fly, the caduceus, or special bag that could safely contain Medusa's severed head, and perhaps most crucially, the strategic advice to use his polished shield as a mirror so he could view Medusa's reflection rather than looking directly at her. This pattern of assistance, providing not overwhelming divine power, but rather the specific tools, knowledge, and strategies that allowed heroes to accomplish their tasks through their own enhanced capabilities, characterized Hermes' approach to helping mortals. He did not simply solve problems for heroes. Instead, he enabled them to solve their own problems, giving them advantages that leveled otherwise impossible odds without completely removing the challenge or danger. A hero aided by Hermes still needed to demonstrate courage, skill, and determination, but they did so with better information, superior equipment, and strategic insights that transformed hopeless situations into merely extremely difficult ones. When Odysseus found himself trapped on Circe's island, his men transformed into swine by her magic, facing an enchantress whose power far exceeded mortal capability to resist. Hermes appeared with a solution characteristically practical and specific. He provided Odysseus with the herb moly, a magical plant that would protect him from Circe's transformative sorcery, and he gave him tactical advice about how to negotiate with her from a position of strength rather than as another victim. The assistance was precisely calibrated, not so much that it removed all challenge, but enough that a clever mortal could use it to turn a hopeless situation into a negotiable one. The relationship between Hermes and mortals was fundamentally different from how most Olympians interacted with humanity. Gods like Zeus or Poseidon or Athena might favor certain heroes and provide assistance, but their aid often came with expectations of worship, gratitude, and continued loyalty. Hermes' assistance seemed less transactional, more aligned with his nature as someone who facilitated movement and transitions. He helped heroes accomplish their quests because that was what he did, because enabling successful boundary crossing and transition was part of his essential function. A hero asking Hermes for aid was not so much supplicating a distant deity as invoking someone whose very purpose included providing exactly the kind of help being requested. Number. The breadth of Hermes's domains meant that virtually every Greek, regardless of their specific occupation or social status, could find some aspect of his identity that related to their lives. A merchant engaged in trade, a shepherd tending flocks, a traveller on a dangerous road, an athlete preparing for competition, an orator crafting a persuasive speech, a thief planning a heist, a dying person preparing for the transition to whatever came next. All of these could pray to Hermes with reasonable expectation that their concerns fell within his purview and that he might offer assistance or at least acknowledgement. This accessibility distinguished Hermes from gods whose domains were narrower or whose concerns seemed more remote from ordinary human experience. Zeus might rule the cosmos, but his attention was consumed by matters of cosmic importance that rarely intersected directly with individual mortal lives. Apollo might illuminate truth and inspire music, but his standards were exacting and his judgments could be harsh. Hermes, by contrast, operated at the level where most human activity actually occurred, in the marketplace, on the roads, at boundaries and transitions, in the morally ambiguous spaces where survival and success required flexibility and cunning rather than rigid adherence to abstract principles. The epithet Dr. Eon, giver of good things, captured this aspect of his nature. Hermes bestowed practical benefits, profitable trade, safe journeys, eloquent speech, athletic victory, successful theft, peaceful death. These were not abstract virtues or distant promises of future reward, but rather immediate, tangible improvements to mortal existence. A prayer to Hermes might be answered quickly and pragmatically, with results that could be observed and appreciated in the moment, rather than requiring faith that divine favor would manifest in some uncertain future. The ubiquity of Hermes throughout the Greek world, at crossroads, boundaries, city gates, home entrances, marketplaces, gymnasiums, served as constant reminders of Hermes's presence and accessibility. These were not temples requiring priestly mediation or elaborate ritual, but rather simple stone markers where anyone could pause for a moment, leave a small offering, and invoke the god's protection or assistance. The casualness of this interaction, the lack of formal structure or hierarchical mediation, reflected Hermes's essential nature as someone who existed at thresholds and crossings rather than in the center of established institutions. His festival, the Hermaia, was celebrated with athletic competitions and contests of cleverness, honoring both the physical speed and mental agility that characterized his nature. Young men would compete in running races, wrestling matches, and other displays of athletic prowess, while also engaging in contests of wit and wordplay that celebrated the verbal dexterity and rhetorical skill under Hermes's patronage. The combination was deliberate. Hermes represented the union of physical and mental capabilities, the understanding that true excellence required both quick feet and quick thinking, both bodily strength and strategic intelligence. In becoming the protector of so many diverse domains, travelers and thieves, merchants and athletes, shepherds and orators, the living and the dead, Hermes embodied a principle that ran counter to the Greek tendency toward categorization and specialization. Where other gods represented specific virtues or domains with relatively clear boundaries, Hermes represented the connections between domains, the transitions and exchanges that occurred at boundaries rather than within established territories. He was the god of the spaces between spaces, the protector of those engaged in crossing rather than remaining, the patron of movement rather than stasis. This made him indispensable to both divine and mortal societies, in ways that more powerful but less flexible gods could never achieve. Zeus might rule Olympus, but Hermes made Olympus function by ensuring communication flowed, by negotiating conflicts, by facilitating the countless exchanges and transitions required for any complex system to operate. The mortal world might be shaped by agriculture and warfare and politics, But Hermes ensured that goods moved between markets, that travelers reached destinations, that the dead found their way to proper rest, that all the boundary crossings and transitions that characterized actual human existence occurred as smoothly as circumstances permitted. From the infant who stole cattle and invented music to the mature god whose domains touched nearly every aspect of Greek life, Hermes had become proof that intelligence, adaptability, and understanding of how systems actually function could create influence as substantial and far-reaching as any achieved through raw power or ancient authority. He protected travelers and thieves, merchants and shepherds, athletes and orators, the living and the dead, not because these domains had obvious connections to each other, but because they all involved movement, exchange, transition, and the crossing of boundaries that others regarded as fixed and absolute. The ultimate legacy of Hermes, the meaning that would echo through centuries of philosophy, art, literature, and human understanding long after the temples fell silent and the sacrifices ceased, was not found in any single story or accomplishment, but rather in what he represented about the nature of existence itself. He was the boundary crosser, the mediator, the god whose very essence involved standing between categories that others considered separate and absolute, demonstrating through every action and every domain that the divisions mortals and immortals alike used to organize reality were never as fixed or final as they appeared. Between gods and mortals, between life and death, between peace and conflict, between chaos and order, between the sacred and the profane. In all these spaces where categories met and overlapped, where transitions occurred and transformations became possible, there existed Hermes, proving that the boundaries themselves were the most interesting and vital parts of existence. The Greeks did not arrive at this understanding through abstract philosophy alone, though their philosophers would eventually recognize and articulate the deeper meanings embedded in Hermes' mythology. Rather, they discovered it through observing how life actually functioned, how societies actually operated, how meaning and value and resources actually moved through the world. Every merchant who successfully negotiated a trade, every traveler who crossed from one territory into another, every diplomat who transformed potential conflict into peaceful agreement, every soul that transitioned from embodied life to whatever awaited beyond death. All of these demonstrated the principle that Hermes embodied, that existence is fundamentally characterized by movement and exchange rather than by static categories and fixed positions. E.c. The role of mediator between gods and mortals was perhaps the most obvious expression of this principle, the function that made Hermes indispensable to the operation of the cosmos as the Greeks understood it. Without someone to carry messages between Olympus and Earth, without an intermediary who could translate divine will into terms mortals could understand and mortal prayers into forms that would gain divine attention, the two realms would exist in isolation from each other, separated by an unbridgeable gulf of difference and incomprehension. Hermes bridged that gulf, not through magical power that eliminated differences, but rather through communication that made differences navigable, through translation that preserved the essential meaning while adapting the expression to suit different audiences and contexts. When Zeus decreed that something must occur in the mortal world, that a hero must undertake a quest, that a city must be punished or rewarded, that some intervention was necessary to maintain cosmic order or advance divine purposes, the decree itself meant nothing until it was communicated to those who would implement it or be affected by it. Hermes transformed abstract divine will into concrete mortal action by serving as the messenger who carried the command, but also by adapting the message to suit the recipient, by providing context and explanation, by negotiating when necessary to ensure that the divine objective could be achieved through mortal means. This was mediation in its truest sense, not simply conveying information unchanged from source to recipient, but rather facilitating understanding and enabling action by actively managing the translation between different modes of existence and comprehension. The stories of Hermes guiding heroes illustrated this mediating function with particular clarity, because heroes existed precisely at the boundary between mortal and divine. They were human beings, subject to death and limited by mortal capabilities. But they were also chosen for extraordinary purposes, called to accomplish tasks that exceeded normal human capacity and brought them into direct contact with divine powers and cosmic forces. Perseus could not slay Medusa through his own abilities alone. The task was literally impossible for an ordinary mortal, as the Gorgon's gaze turned anyone who looked upon her into stone. But Hermes, understanding both the divine requirement that Medusa be slain and the mortal limitations that made direct confrontation suicidal, provided the tools and knowledge that made the impossible merely extremely difficult. The polished shield that allowed Perseus to view Medusa's reflection, the winged sandals that granted him supernatural mobility, the guidance to find the Grey Eye who possessed crucial information. These were not solutions imposed from divine power, but rather enhancements to mortal capability that preserved human agency while acknowledging divine support. Similarly, when Odysseus faced Circe's magic, when he confronted a power that operated according to rules completely foreign to mortal understanding, Hermes appeared with the herb moly and strategic advice that allowed the hero to negotiate from strength rather than becoming another victim transformed into an animal. The assistance was perfectly calibrated, not so much that it removed all challenge and made the hero merely a puppet through which divine will operated, but enough that intelligence and courage could succeed where they would otherwise have been crushed by superior supernatural force. This balance characterized Hermes' approach to mediation. He facilitated successful outcomes by providing what was minimally necessary for success, maintaining the distinction between mortal and divine, while creating bridges that made interaction and cooperation possible. The mediation between life and death represented perhaps the most profound of all Hermes' boundary-crossing functions, because this was the transition that every mortal would eventually experience, the movement from one state of existence to another that defined the fundamental difference between gods and humans. Immortals existed perpetually, mortals existed temporarily, and then transformed into something else, shades in the underworld, memories in the minds of the living, stories preserved in epic poetry. The transition itself was the moment when embodied consciousness ceased, and whatever remained began its journey to final disposition, and Hermes was the guide who ensured this transition occurred properly, that souls did not become lost or trapped between worlds, that the boundary between life and death remained permeable enough for necessary passage, while maintaining its integrity as a genuine divide. His role as Psychopomp gave Hermes a perspective on mortality that other Olympians could never fully share. He witnessed every death, saw the moment when the living became dead, understood in ways that eternal beings typically could not, the significance of finitude and the poignancy of endings. This constant exposure to mortality shaped his interactions with both gods and mortals, giving him empathy for human fragility that was unusual among Olympians who typically viewed mortal lives as brief and relatively insignificant. Hermes guided souls with the same care, whether they were heroes or ordinary people, whether they died gloriously in battle or quietly in old age, because his role was not to judge, but rather to facilitate transition, to ensure that the boundary between life and death could be crossed when necessary, while maintaining the cosmic order that kept the realms separate. The myths that show Hermes guiding souls back from the underworld, returning Persephone to Demeter, accompanying Orpheus in his doomed attempt to retrieve Eurydice, assisting heroes who must visit the realm of the dead while still living, emphasized that boundaries, while real and meaningful, were not absolutely impermeable when sufficient reason existed to cross them. Persephone could return from the underworld because cosmic balance required it, because her mother's grief threatened to destroy all life on Earth, and therefore some compromise had to be negotiated between Demeter's need and Hades' claim. Hermes facilitated that negotiation, carrying messages between the upper and lower worlds, working out the terms by which Persephone would spend part of each year in each realm, creating the seasonal cycle that the Greeks used to explain the agricultural patterns that sustained their civilization. The mediation required understanding the legitimate claims of all parties. Demeter's maternal love, Hades' possession of his abducted bride, Zeus's need to maintain order, and finding solutions that acknowledged all claims while preventing the catastrophe that would result if any single party achieved complete victory. Orpheus's journey to retrieve Eurydice demonstrated the limits of mediation, the recognition that some boundaries exist for profound reasons and cannot be crossed without consequences. Hermes accompanied Orpheus into the underworld, guided him to Hades and Persephone, witnessed the moment when Orpheus's music moved the rulers of the dead to grant unprecedented mercy. But the condition imposed that Orpheus must lead Eurydice out without looking back, must trust that she followed without requiring visual confirmation, proved impossible for mortal psychology to satisfy. When Orpheus turned to look, when his need for certainty overcame his commitment to trust, Eurydice vanished back into death, and the opportunity for her return was lost forever. Hermes witnessed this tragedy without preventing it, because his role was to facilitate transitions that could legitimately occur, not to override the fundamental rules that maintained cosmic order. The boundary between life and death was real, and while it could sometimes be crossed under extraordinary circumstances, it could not be eliminated without destroying the very structure of existence. The mediation between peace and conflict represented another crucial aspect of Hermes' function, because conflicts, whether between gods, between mortals, or between gods and mortals, threatened constantly to escalate into catastrophic violence that would disrupt cosmic order and destroy the delicate balances that made civilization possible. When tensions arose between Olympians, when divine egos clashed and divine powers prepared to manifest in destructive ways, Hermes often served as the diplomat who negotiated settlements, who found compromises that allowed all parties to preserve their dignity while avoiding open warfare. His cleverness and understanding of psychology, both divine and mortal, made him effective at finding solutions that others missed, at identifying what each party truly needed, as opposed to what they claimed to demand, at constructing agreements that satisfied essential interests while requiring concessions on peripheral issues. The story of his intervention in the Trojan War illustrated this diplomatic function operating under the most difficult circumstances, when a decade of brutal conflict had hardened positions and created such deep animosity that peace seemed impossible. When King Priam of Troy sought to ransom his son Hector's body from Achilles, when an aged father had to enter enemy territory and face the warrior who had killed his son and desecrated the corpse, the mission required more than courage. It required someone who could create the conditions for a conversation that transcended rage and grief and pride. Hermes guided Priam safely through the Greek camps, navigating past guards and warriors who would have killed the Trojan king on sight, and then helped facilitate the encounter between Priam and Achilles that allowed both men to recognize their shared humanity despite being mortal enemies. The mediation did not end the war. The conflict would continue until Troy fell and Achilles died. But it created a moment of grace and understanding that demonstrated even in the midst of ultimate enmity, communication remained possible, and shared recognition of fundamental human experiences could create brief truces. The importance of this mediating function extended beyond individual conflicts to encompass the fundamental operation of society itself, because human civilization required constant negotiation and compromise to function. Markets required buyers and sellers to negotiate prices that both parties found acceptable. Trade between cities required agreements about safe passage and fair dealing. Diplomatic relations between states required envoys who could communicate effectively and negotiate terms that prevented war while protecting essential interests. All of these negotiations were expressions of the principle that Hermes embodied, that different parties with different interests and different perspectives could find mutually acceptable solutions through communication and strategic compromise rather than through force or domination. His role as patron of rhetoric and eloquence connected directly to this mediating function, because effective communication was the tool through which mediation occurred. The ability to speak persuasively, to frame arguments in ways that resonated with particular audiences, to anticipate objections and prepare responses, to use language strategically to achieve desired outcomes. These skills were essential to anyone who sought to navigate complex social situations and bridge differences through negotiation rather than violence. Hermes blessed orators with the eloquence to move audiences, diplomats with the words to diffuse tensions, merchants with the persuasive abilities to close deals, because all of these activities involved crossing boundaries between different perspectives and creating shared understanding where initially only difference existed. The emphasis in Hermes' mythology on cleverness and adaptability as supreme virtues represented a profound statement about how the Greeks understood effective action in the world. The theft of Apollo's cattle demonstrated that a newborn god with no physical strength or established authority could nonetheless achieve his objectives through superior intelligence and strategic planning. The invention of the lyre and its exchange for the stolen cattle showed that creation and negotiation could transform criminal liability into mutually beneficial partnership. But countless myths in which Hermes helped heroes accomplish impossible tasks through providing tools, information, and strategic advice emphasized that knowing how to approach a problem was often more valuable than possessing overwhelming force to simply power through obstacles. This celebration of intelligence over strength, of flexibility over rigidity, of strategic thinking over straightforward confrontation, resonated deeply with Greek culture precisely because it reflected how most humans actually had to operate in the world. The Greeks understood that most people did not possess the strength of Heracles, or the beauty of Aphrodite, or the wisdom of Athena. Most people had to navigate life using whatever resources they possessed, adapting to circumstances they could not control, finding clever solutions to problems they could not solve through direct action. Hermes represented the possibility that ordinary capabilities, when combined with intelligence and strategic thinking and willingness to operate flexibly rather than according to rigid principles, could achieve extraordinary outcomes. The trickster aspects of his nature, the willingness to deceive when necessary, to bend rules when strict adherence would produce suboptimal outcomes, to operate in morally grey areas when black and white principles proved inadequate to complex situations, acknowledged a truth about human existence that more idealistic philosophies often tried to deny, that survival and success frequently required compromising abstract principles in favor of practical effectiveness. Hermes was not amoral, but he operated according to situational ethics rather than absolute rules, understanding that context mattered enormously in determining appropriate action. Stealing food when hungry was different from stealing for profit. Deceiving an enemy to prevent harm was different from deceiving a friend for personal gain. Breaking a rule to achieve a just outcome was different from breaking it for selfish purposes. The god of thieves and the god of merchants were the same deity because both roles required understanding that resources moved between hands through various means, and the moral status of that movement depended on circumstances and consequences rather than on simple categorical judgments. 2. Communication itself, that fundamental human capacity that distinguished humans from other animals and made civilization possible, was inherently a form of boundary crossing that fell naturally under Hermes' domain. Every time someone spoke to another person, they were attempting to transfer meaning from one consciousness to another, to create shared understanding between distinct minds, to bridge the fundamental isolation that characterized individual existence. Language was the tool that made this possible, but language required interpretation, required both speaker and listener to share enough common context and understanding that words could carry meaning successfully across the boundary between separate selves. Hermes presided over this process, not because he invented language. Different traditions attributed that innovation to various sources, but because the act of communication itself was fundamentally an act of mediation, of creating connections between separated entities, of transforming private thought into shared understanding. Writing extended this communicative capacity across time, as well as space, allowing messages to persist long after their authors died, allowing knowledge to accumulate across generations rather than being lost when individuals passed away. Some traditions credited Hermes with inventing writing, or at least with bringing it to humanity, recognizing that the ability to preserve and transmit information through written symbols represented a profound boundary crossing between present and future, between living authors and readers not yet born. The connection made logical sense. Writing was communication that operated across the ultimate boundary of mortality, allowing the dead to speak to the living through texts that survived physical dissolution. The philosophical implications of Hermes's mythology extended far beyond religious practice or literary tradition, influencing how Greek thinkers understood fundamental questions about the nature of reality and human existence. The recognition that boundaries were real but negotiable, that categories were useful but not absolute, that the spaces between established positions were often more interesting and vital than the positions themselves. These insights shaped Greek philosophy's characteristic willingness to question assumptions, to explore paradoxes, to recognize that truth often existed in synthesis rather than in choosing one side of a binary opposition. The Hermetic tradition that would develop in later centuries, claiming Hermes as its patron and source. Though this Hermes Trismegistus, thrice a great Hermes, was a syncretic fusion of the Greek god with the Egyptian deity Thoth, embodied this philosophical legacy. Hermetic philosophy emphasized hidden knowledge, secret wisdom, the understanding that reality operated according to principles not immediately apparent to casual observation. The emphasis on communication between different realms of existence, physical and spiritual, material and ideal, mortal and divine, reflected Hermes' essential nature as boundary crosser and mediator. Whether or not the later Hermetic texts actually preserved ancient wisdom or represented medieval inventions claiming ancient authority, they demonstrated the enduring power of Hermes as a symbol of esoteric knowledge and transformative understanding. Number. The Romans, when they absorbed Greek mythology into their own religious system, recognized in Hermes a deity whose functions were so essential that they simply adopted him wholesale as Mercury, maintaining nearly all his attributes and domains while giving him a Latin name. Mercury became the patron of Roman merchants and travelers, just as Hermes had served Greek ones. He carried messages between gods and mortals in Roman myth, just as Hermes had in Greek stories. He guided souls to the afterlife and presided over boundaries and transitions and all forms of exchange and communication. The easy translation between Greek Hermes and Roman Mercury demonstrated that the principles he embodied transcended particular cultural contexts. Every society needed mediators, every economy required exchange, every civilization depended on communication and negotiation to function. The artistic traditions that depicted Hermes emphasized his liminal nature through visual symbolism that viewers could immediately recognize and understand. The winged sandals represented supernatural speed, but also the capacity for flight, for movement that transcended normal constraints of geography and gravity, for existing between earth and sky rather than bound to either. The patasos, his broad-brimmed traveller's hat, marked him as someone perpetually on a journey rather than settled in a fixed location. The caduceus with its intertwined serpents represented duality and harmony, opposing forces woven together rather than locked in destructive conflict, different principles coexisting in dynamic balance rather than one dominating the other. Artists showed him in motion, mid-stride or mid-flight, oriented toward a destination rather than occupying a stable position, because stasis was fundamentally contrary to his nature. The Hermes themselves. Those stone markers, erected at crossroads and boundaries throughout the Greek world, represented perhaps the most direct and practical expression of Hermes' importance to ordinary people's daily lives. These were not elaborate temples requiring priests and elaborate rituals, but rather simple monuments where anyone could pause for a moment, acknowledge the god's presence, leave a small offering, and invoke protection or blessing before continuing their journey. The ubiquity of Hermes demonstrated that Hermes was not a remote deity concerned only with cosmic matters, but rather a god whose influence touched the practical realities of travel and trade and all the boundary crossings that characterized ordinary human existence. The paradoxes that characterized Hermes, protector of both travelers and thieves, patron of both honest merchants and cunning cheats, guide to both the living and the dead, servant of cosmic order who achieved his position through committing crimes, were not contradictions that needed to be resolved or explained away, but rather reflections of his fundamental nature as someone who existed at boundaries where opposing categories met and overlapped. He could embrace apparent contradictions, because he understood that reality was more complex than simple binary categories suggested, that the same action could be simultaneously right and wrong depending on perspective and context, that effectiveness often required operating in grey areas where absolute principles provided inadequate guidance. This capacity to hold contradictions in productive tension, to operate effectively in situations where clear rules and simple principles failed, made Hermes indispensable to both divine and mortal societies. Zeus needed someone who could accomplish tasks that required more flexibility than the straightforward Olympians possessed. Mortals needed a deity who understood that human life rarely presented clear choices between obvious good and obvious evil, but rather constant navigation of ambiguous situations where survival and success required strategic thinking and moral flexibility. Hermes provided what both needed: mediation that acknowledged complexity, communication that created understanding across differences, guidance that helped navigate uncertainty without pretending that uncertainty could be eliminated. The legacy that Hermes left to subsequent cultures extended far beyond the specific stories told about him in Greek mythology. He became a symbol of the principle that boundaries exist to be crossed, that communication creates connections between separated entities, that intelligence and adaptability can achieve what force and rigidity cannot, that the spaces between established categories are often where the most interesting and vital aspects of existence occur. Every diplomat negotiating between hostile parties, every merchant facilitating exchange between buyer and seller, every traveller crossing from familiar territory into unknown lands, every writer attempting to communicate meaning to readers, every soul making the final transition from life to death. All of these enacted the principles that Hermes embodied. All participated in the eternal human necessity of crossing boundaries and mediating between different realms of existence. In the end, Hermes represented something fundamentally optimistic about existence: the recognition that differences could be bridged through communication, that conflicts could be resolved through negotiation, that intelligence could find solutions to problems that seemed impossible when approached through force alone. The infant who stole cattle and invented music, who transformed crime into partnership through clever negotiation, who became indispensable to the cosmic order through demonstrating capabilities that complemented rather than competed with established power. This was a story about possibility, about the potential for cleverness and adaptability to create value and earn respect, regardless of initial disadvantages. The boundary crosser, the mediator, the guide who moved freely between realms that others considered separate and absolute. Hermes endured as a symbol because the functions he performed and the principles he embodied remained eternally necessary to human civilization. As long as people needed to communicate across differences, negotiate between competing interests, travel between familiar and unfamiliar territories, and make the final transition from life to whatever comes after, the spirit of Hermes would persist, reminding us that boundaries exist not to prevent crossing, but to mark the transitions where transformation becomes possible, where separate entities can meet and create something new through their interaction. From birth to eternal function, from cattle thief to divine messenger, from trickster to trusted mediator. The journey of Hermes was the story of how intelligence, communication, and adaptability could not only survive in a world dominated by greater powers, but could become indispensable to that world's continued operation. And in that story, generations of humans found both inspiration and practical wisdom, recognizing in the god of boundaries and transitions a reflection of their own constant necessity to navigate between different states, to communicate across differences, to find clever solutions to complex problems, and to accept that the most vital aspects of existence often occur not within established categories, but rather in the liminal spaces where categories meet, overlap, and transform into something neither one nor the other, but both and more. Vi-O-Y